I watched her twirl under the lights on the dance floor, smiling as if the world was perfect. The music echoed in the hall, vibrating along with the champagne glasses clinking all around. Her eyes sparkled, locked on his, the man everyone thought was just a work colleague. Their hands intertwined, moving in sync, a perfectly rehearsed dance, the same one she used with me years ago, when we were still happy. At that moment, holding the divorce letter in my jacket, I felt the betrayal burn deep in my chest. A pain as sharp as the silence that had been eating away at our marriage for months. Her image, the woman who promised to love me until death do us part, was now a distorted reflection, an echo of broken promises. The people around us were laughing, chatting, living their lives without knowing that there, in the middle of the party, a story was coming to an end. I already knew everything. Every lie, every poorly told excuse, every afternoon when she came home with her hair done up too much for someone who was just working late. Knowing wasn't the worst part. The worst part was seeing the way she smiled at him, a smile I hadn't seen in years. Maybe I'd never seen it. She didn't know I was there, standing on the edge of the road, just a few steps away from the chaos I was about to unleash. In that instant, the world stopped around me. I remember taking a deep breath and crossing the hall like a man walking to his own execution, each step firm, resolute. As I approached, my mind reviewed the last few months like quick flashes in a bad movie. "You've been distant," I said one evening, sitting at the dinner table. "What's going on with us?" "You're imagining things," she replied without even looking at me, her eyes fixed on her cell phone. "It's just tiredness from work." "And why are you always smiling at tiredness when he calls you at night?" That was the first time the silence between us wasn't just empty. It was a heavy silence, of secrets dragged between walls that had long ceased to be a home. She looked at me then, and for a second, I saw the guilt shining in her eyes before hiding behind a neutral expression. The music was playing loudly when I finally stopped in front of her. She noticed my presence, her smile slowly fading like paint dripping from a painting. The man next to her stopped too, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. I didn't say anything. I just took the letter out of my pocket and held it out to her. She took it, her hands trembling, as if she already knew what it was before she even read it. I didn't have to say a word. My expression said everything the paper would confirm. "Can we talk about this?" she asked, almost in a whisper. For the first time, she looked fragile. Frightened. "No," I replied, turning around. My voice was firm, without hesitation. "We've already talked too much in the silences." I walked away, leaving her standing there under the lights, the divorce paper crumpled in her hands. She tried to follow me, but I was already walking away. I didn't need to look back to know that when she opened the letter and read every line, despair took hold of her. Not for the end of the marriage, that had been over for a long time. But for the clear warning that she would be left with nothing. Nothing. As I left the hall, I could hear the murmur of people beginning to notice what was happening. I saw confused faces turn towards her, whispers growing like a fire about to consume everything. A betrayal like this never goes unnoticed for long. In the parking lot, the cold of the night hit me like a punch. I needed air. I needed to think, but thinking was impossible. My mind echoed images of her with him. How many times? How many smiles? How many lies? When did she start being more his than mine? My chest felt as if someone was digging a hole inside me. As if with each memory, another part of me was being ripped out. Why had she done this? What makes someone betray the person they promised to share a life with? Was it me? Was I not enough? There were no answers to these questions. And perhaps they never would. At that moment, standing next to the car, with the silence of the night broken only by the distant sound of music, I remembered the time she held my hand, looked into my eyes and told me she loved me. I remembered the day we got married, the promises we made in front of our families and friends. I remembered when we were us and not just two strangers sharing a roof. The past is a cruel trap. It appears when we least expect it, throwing everything that once made us happy in our faces and then showing us how it all fell apart. Could I forgive her? Could I pretend that nothing happened? No. Some things are unforgivable. Some things mark us forever, like a scar too deep to erase. As I stared at the horizon, I felt my cell phone vibrate in my pocket. It was her. Calling, probably to try to explain herself. To ask for another chance. To convince me that it was all a mistake. But mistakes aren't danced away in the middle of a party with smiles and intertwined hands. Mistakes don't last for months hidden in the dark. I didn't answer. There was nothing more to say. I knew that night would be the start of something new, although I didn't know what. The pain was still there, burning like an open wound, but a part of me felt that maybe this was necessary. Maybe it was the only way to free myself from a marriage that had been dead for a long time. And what would she do now? How would she deal with the loneliness she had chosen for herself? How would she face the consequences of her actions when everyone found out what she had done? Life has a cruel way of settling scores. Betrayals never come without a price. What she didn't know, and what even I couldn't have predicted that night, was that the worst was yet to come. The walls of her perfect world would crumble one by one, and there would be no one to hold her up when they fell. But she didn't know that yet. Welcome to the channel. We don't support any kind of betrayal here. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry a universal truth: betrayal destroys lives and leaves marks that even time can't erase. The aim is to show the real consequences of wrong choices and the devastating impact they have. Get ready for a shocking and impactful story that will stir your emotions and make you think. Now, take a deep breath. The truth is not always easy to hear. Good story. The living room was bathed in soft light coming in through the huge windows, illuminating the impeccably organized furniture. The house looked like something out of a catalog: leather sofas, bookshelves with perfectly aligned books and framed photographs scattered around like little milestones of a life together. Every corner of the place held a story. A trip, an anniversary, a celebration. To anyone who entered, everything seemed to indicate a peaceful and successful life. A perfect family. And at the center of it all were Michael and Laura. He, a tall man of 38, with dark hair that had already started to gray, carried a firm and secure presence. The owner of a consistently growing accounting firm, Michael was known for his professionalism and commitment to everything he did. A born leader, but also someone who knew how to be a loyal friend. When he entered the house, his serious face would soften when he met Laura, as if she were the only place where he could truly rest. Laura, on the other hand, was sweet, elegant and always wrapped in a discreet charm that enchanted anyone who met her. At 35, she was a marketing coordinator for a large company, known for her creativity and ability to lead brilliant campaigns. Together with Michael, she formed the couple that everyone admired. They were childhood friends, in love since their teens, and together they had built an admirable life. A 12-year marriage, which seemed to be the picture of a balanced partnership, full of respect and affection. But not everything was as perfect as it seemed. Mornings in the house were quiet, but mechanical. Michael woke up early, before the alarm clock, and went downstairs to make the coffee. The routine was almost sacred. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as he flicked through the newspaper on the kitchen table. Laura came down a few minutes later, her hair still loose and wearing a light robe that contrasted with the darkness of her eyes. The slight smile they exchanged as they sat down was almost a silent ritual, an implicit pact that all was well. "Do you have an important meeting today?" Laura asked, breaking the silence as she put sugar in her coffee. "Yes, I'm meeting some new clients. It's a big contract, it could be good for the office." He paused, watching her as she stirred her coffee with slow movements. "What about you? Any campaign launches?" "Oh, just another meeting with the design people." Nothing too exciting. Laura answered without taking her eyes off the cup, but Michael noticed the tired tone in her voice. There was a distance there, something he couldn't touch, but had felt growing between them for some time. And he hated to admit, even to himself, that he no longer knew how to cross that space. Throughout the day, Laura immersed herself in her work. It was easier to lose herself in ideas and meetings than to face the persistent feeling of emptiness that arose every time she was alone. The office was a refuge where she could be someone else, someone independent, someone valued, someone whose life wasn't about uncomfortable silences and dinners that were more like formalities. Michael, on the other hand, spent his days busy with spreadsheets and contracts, but Laura's image often invaded his thoughts. He loved her. He knew he loved her. But in recent years, something had changed. Perhaps routine, perhaps time. The passion that had once consumed them had been replaced by a peaceful coexistence, like two pieces of a puzzle that fit together, but no longer formed the complete picture. Evenings at home were almost predictable. They had dinner together, exchanged a few words about the day and then retired to the living room to watch some series that neither of them really paid attention to. The silence between them was safe, but uncomfortable. It was like being alone next to the person who had once been everything. One evening, while Laura washed the dishes after dinner, Michael watched her from the kitchen door. The water was falling, the steam was slowly rising, and he felt a sudden urge to come closer, to touch her, as he had done in the early years of their marriage. But something held him in place. Perhaps it was the fear of being unrequited. Perhaps it was the fear of realizing that the void between them wasn't just a passing phase. "Laura," he called softly. She turned around in surprise, wiping her hands on the tea towel. "Yes." Michael hesitated for a second before releasing what seemed to be stuck in his throat. "Are you happy?" The question hung in the air like distant thunder. Laura stared at him, her dark eyes reflecting an emotion he couldn't identify. It wasn't a complete surprise. She knew he felt it too. She knew that the weight of the silence was shared between them, even if they had never spoken about it. "Of course, Michael. Why wouldn't I be?" She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. He nodded, as if that answer was enough. He wouldn't insist. Not that night. As they lay in bed, each on their own side, Michael stared at the dark ceiling, trying to shake off the restlessness that consumed him. He loved Laura. He knew that. But he was beginning to doubt whether their love was enough to fill the growing void. Laura, on the other side, remained awake. She loved Michael too. He had been her first and only love. But lately, she felt like an actress playing a role that no longer belonged to her. She wondered if it was her fault. If she was becoming someone Michael could no longer love. The weeks went on like this. Unspoken words, screaming silences. Each of them trapped in their own loneliness, unable to find their way back to each other. The house that had once been a home began to seem too empty a space for two strangers who no longer knew how to touch. In everyone's eyes, Michael and Laura were still the perfect couple. No one noticed the lost glances, the avoided touches, the empty conversations. They were good at keeping up appearances. But inside, they both felt like they were walking on a thin layer of ice, waiting for the moment when everything would shatter. That Friday, Laura received an invitation to the company's annual party. A formal event, full of speeches, toasts and live music. It was tradition for Michael to accompany her, but that year, something in her hesitated before asking. "Are we going to my company party this year?" She asked casually, while getting dressed for work. Michael looked up from his newspaper and, for a moment, seemed about to deny it. But then he forced a smile. "Of course. It's important to you, isn't it?" "Yes," she replied, looking away. The party was in 2 weeks' time. Laura spent hours choosing the perfect dress, the right shoes. She looked in the mirror several times, searching for something that perhaps even she didn't know what it was. She wanted to feel alive. She wanted to remember who she was. Michael, on the other hand, saw the party as just another obligation. He put on his suit of armor, ready to smile and do what he always did, play the role of the perfect husband. The ballroom was packed on the night of the party, with twinkling lights and music. Couples danced, co-workers laughed between sips of champagne. Laura seemed to shine that night. Her navy blue dress highlighted her elegant figure, and her eyes shone with an intensity that Michael hadn't seen for a long time. He watched her from afar as she circulated among the guests, laughing, chatting, as if this were her real world. But there was something there, something out of place. And Michael felt it the instant Laura's gaze met his from across the room. For a second, he saw a deep sadness hidden behind that perfect smile. That night, fate was about to set in motion pieces that would change their lives forever. And, although neither of them could have known it, that would be the last smile Michael would keep from her as an intact memory. The hall was still filled with an almost magical atmosphere, as the sound of music echoed off the walls decorated with soft lights. Michael stood in a corner, holding a glass of whiskey that he hadn't even touched. His eyes watched Laura from a distance, studying every movement, every smile, every delicate gesture with an attention he didn't know where it came from. Perhaps it was instinct, a low, insistent voice inside him, that whispered that something was out of place, although he still didn't know what it was. She was beautiful, there was no denying that. The navy blue dress that hugged her curves, the carefully arranged hair, the sparkle in her eyes. That same sparkle he hadn't seen in a long time when she looked at him. There was something different that night. A kind of almost brazen freedom in her posture, as if the weight of routine had disappeared for a few hours. Laura seemed alive. "Are you all right?" asked one of Michael's work colleagues, approaching with a friendly smile. Michael, who hadn't even noticed the approach, turned around with a start. "Yes, of course," he replied automatically, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired." It was an easy excuse, but it was a lie. It wasn't tiredness. It was a growing restlessness, a feeling that, at any moment, something could fall apart. Across the hall, Laura was talking to a group of colleagues, laughing at something that had just been said. Her eyes, however, constantly wandered to a familiar figure, him, the man in the gray suit, the easy smile and a confidence that seemed to radiate from him like a beacon. Their gazes met from time to time, like a silent pact hidden between the laughter and the toasts. Michael watched the scene. He didn't know the man, but that look didn't lie. There was no apparent reason to be suspicious, but it was as if an invisible signal was being projected between Laura and this stranger, something that only he seemed to notice. That was what bothered him most of all. The way she smiled at that man, a smile he hadn't seen for years. The evening progressed slowly. The music changed to something softer, and people started making their way to the dance floor. Michael stayed where he was, standing back, like a spectator at a show he didn't want to watch, but he couldn't look away. Laura and the man in the gray suit remained close. From where he was, Michael could hear fragments of a low conversation, accompanied by laughter and subtle touches. A hand touching her arm for too long, a look that lasted longer than it should have. Every detail seemed to be magnified in her eyes, as if someone had adjusted the focus on her pain. Michael felt his heart racing. His breathing became heavy. He was trying to convince himself that it was just paranoia, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but the scene in front of him made that impossible. That was the look of two people who shared something more than friendship. It was too familiar, too intimate. "I need some air," he muttered to himself, discreetly leaving the room. Outside, the cold of the night hit him hard, bringing momentary relief. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the cold sweat on his forehead. It couldn't be right. Laura would never do anything like that. They were going through a difficult time, yes, but he believed she was faithful. He wanted to believe it. As he walked around the side of the building, Michael's mind spun in circles, replaying every detail of that night. The looks, the laughter, the touch. He tried to push the thoughts away, but it was as if they had become ingrained in his skin. The weight of doubt consumed him. Suddenly, he heard a muffled laugh, a sound coming from somewhere behind the building. Michael stopped. His muscles stiffened as he followed the sound, each step carrying an unknown weight. He didn't know why he was going in that direction. Maybe it was instinct again. Maybe he already knew. As he turned the corner, his eyes met what he had never imagined he would see. There, in the dim light of a street lamp, Laura was with the man in the gray suit. She was leaning against the wall, her arms around his neck, while he held her by the waist. Their faces were too close, too intimate. Then it happened, he leaned in and kissed her. A slow, deep kiss, as if there was nothing else in the world. Michael's heart seemed to stop. For a moment, he was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. Time slowed down. He felt the ground open up under his feet. Each heartbeat was like a knife in his chest. Laura. His Laura. She didn't hesitate. She didn't resist. She returned the kiss with the same intensity, as if he were the only thing that mattered. Michael felt a wave of heat surge through his body, followed by a chill that left him trembling. It wasn't anger yet, it was disbelief. A shock so great that he almost couldn't process what he was seeing. He wanted to scream, he wanted to interrupt them, but his legs wouldn't move. Finally, he took a step back, his eyes still fixed on the scene. The betrayal before him was like a cruel masterpiece, meticulously constructed. He felt as if a part of him was dying at that moment, something that could never be recovered. Laura pulled away from the man slowly, smiling at him before whispering something Michael couldn't hear. The two of them parted, straightening up as if nothing had happened, and started walking back to the lounge, not even realizing that Michael was there, watching everything. He waited until they had both disappeared around the corner before letting out the breath he didn't even know he was holding. His knees almost gave way, but he leaned against the wall, his mind spinning. Every detail of that scene was etched into his memory with cruel precision. The pain began to give way to something darker. Anger. Resentment. He felt tears fill his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Not there. Not that night. When he finally returned to the ballroom, Michael's face was pale, but his expression was hard, controlled. Laura danced again, as if nothing had happened, as if they were still the perfect couple that everyone admired. She smiled at people, chatted with friends, while the man in the gray suit circled the room, greeting colleagues with the same confidence. Michael knew he couldn't confront her there. Not in front of everyone. But one thing was certain, it wouldn't go unpunished. He wouldn't let it. As he looked at Laura for the last time that night, Michael felt that something inside him had changed forever. The man who entered that party was not the same man who would leave it. The emptiness he had felt over the last few months now seemed insignificant next to the pain of betrayal. He didn't know what he would do next. He didn't know how he would face Laura or what he would say when he faced her. But he did know one thing, the silence between them would no longer be a safe haven. Silence would now be a weapon. Michael left the hall without looking back. The cold night air seemed almost welcoming compared to the storm growing inside him. And as he walked to his car, a single certainty accompanied him, the worst was yet to come. The silence in the house was almost deafening when Michael opened the door. It was after midnight, and the only sound came from the clock in the living room, which seemed to be ticking louder than usual, echoing through the empty corridors. He dropped his keys on the hall table with an automatic gesture, his shoulders heavy, his steps dragging. The memory of that scene at the party still burned in his mind like an open wound. Laura. The other man. The betrayal. Michael climbed the stairs slowly, feeling each step like a struggle against the weight he was carrying. He didn't turn on the lights when he entered the room, but he knew she was there. Lying there, breathing deeply, as if she were sleeping peacefully. He stopped in the middle of the room, watching her for a moment. It was hard to believe that this woman, the same with whom he had shared years of life, could have betrayed everything they had built. Michael? Laura's voice sounded low, sleepy, as she turned to face him. You're late. She turned on the lamp and blinked a few times, trying to get used to the light. When she saw his face, something in her eyes changed. A mixture of surprise and apprehension. What's wrong? She asked, slowly sitting up. Michael didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. Finally, he let out a long, heavy sigh, wiping his hand across his face before sitting down in the armchair next to the bed. We need to talk, he said, his voice firm but emotionless. Laura straightened up, her heart racing. She felt the gravity of those words, the weight they carried. Her mind began to spin, searching for answers, preparing excuses that she didn't yet know if she would have to use. Talk about what? She tried, her voice faltering slightly. Michael raised his eyes slowly, and the look he cast at her was enough to freeze her in place. He didn't need to say anything. Laura knew he knew. I saw you, he said, the words coming out almost in a whisper, but each one cutting through the air like a blade. At the party. Behind the building. Laura's face paled instantly. She opened her mouth, but couldn't make a sound. It was as if all the excuses, all the lies she had prepared over the months had evaporated in that instant. Don't try to deny it, Laura, Michael continued, his voice firmer now. I saw it with my own eyes. She finally managed to speak, but her voice was shaking. Michael, please. I can explain. Explain what? Anger began to surface, breaking through the controlled facade he had maintained until then. Explain why you were kissing that man. Why were you smiling at him as if I had never existed? Explain what, Laura? It wasn't what you think. Laura exclaimed, getting up from the bed. Please listen to me. Michael let out a bitter laugh, getting up too. He looked at her like someone who had finally seen the truth after being blind for a long time. Isn't that what I think? He repeated, ironically. So tell me, Laura. What is it? Because from my point of view, you seemed quite comfortable in that man's arms. She remained silent, the tears starting to run down her face. Michael watched her, waiting for an answer, waiting for something that might somehow make sense. But nothing came. The silence dragged on until, finally, he spoke again, his voice lower but laden with pain. How could you? Laura collapsed on the edge of the bed, hiding her face in her hands as she sobbed. Michael stood there, watching her cry, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness that consumed him inside. For a moment, he thought about leaving, walking away and never looking back. But he needed to hear the truth. He needed to know how far this had gone. Who is he? Michael asked, breaking the silence. Laura was slow to answer. When she did, her voice was almost a whisper. A colleague, from work. Michael clenched his fists, closing his eyes for a moment as if that could help him contain the anger that threatened to overflow. How long ago? His voice was cold now, calculated. Laura hesitated, her gaze fixed on the floor. She knew that, whatever his answer, there was no way out. 6 months, she finally answered, almost inaudibly. Michael took a deep breath, trying to process those words. 6 months. Half a lifetime of lies. All of that happening under his nose, while he worried about maintaining the marriage, about trying to reconnect with her. It was as if the ground had disappeared, as if everything he believed in was crumbling. Why, Laura? He asked, his voice now broken. What did I do to deserve this? She looked up, her face streaked with tears. It wasn't you, Michael. It wasn't your fault. Then whose fault was it? He exploded, his voice finally breaking out of its restraint. You mean to tell me that I wasn't good enough? That our marriage wasn't good enough for you? He stopped, choking on his words. Laura shook her head in despair. I've lost myself, Michael. I don't know what happened to me. I just wanted to feel alive again. I know it's no excuse, but I felt suffocated for so long. And he made me feel things I didn't even know existed. Her words were like knives driven straight into Michael's heart. He took a step back, as if he needed to get away from it, as if he needed to escape. You've thrown everything away, Laura. Everything we built. On a whim? On an impulse? He laughed, an empty sound, without any joy. And now? What did you expect to happen? That I would simply forget and forgive? Laura sobbed louder, but didn't answer. She knew there was nothing she could say to fix what she had done. Michael stood there, looking at her, trying to find the woman he had known, the woman he had fallen in love with, but she was no longer there. The Laura in front of him was a stranger. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low, controlled. I'm leaving this house tomorrow morning. When I get back, I want you out of here. Laura's eyes widened in despair. Michael, no. Please. She stood up, trying to get closer to him, but he took a step back. Don't leave me like this. I know I made a mistake, but we can make it right. I still love you. Love? Michael laughed bitterly. You don't know what love is, Laura. If you did, you wouldn't have done what you did. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone. Laura fell to her knees, her tears falling uncontrollably as the sound of Michael's footsteps disappeared down the corridor. In the silence that followed, the truth finally hit her full force. She had lost. She had lost the man who loved her, the man who had sacrificed so much for her. And now, all that remained was emptiness. An emptiness as deep as the darkness that enveloped her that night. As the clock continued its relentless ticking, Michael descended the stairs and stopped in the middle of the living room, his eyes fixed on the front door. His heart was breaking, but there was a certainty growing inside him: he would not allow this betrayal to destroy him. There would be a reckoning. And when the time came, he would be ready. Michael spent a sleepless night on the sofa in the living room. The house, once a refuge, now seemed an oppressive space, full of shadows that whispered of betrayal. Every corner, every photograph, everything reminded him of Laura. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, the image of her in another man's arms came back with full force. His heart beat heavily in his chest, his blood ran hot, a mixture of anger, humiliation and hurt. Around 5 a.m, the silence was broken by the sound of slow footsteps on the stairs. Michael didn't have to look to know it was Laura. He remained motionless, staring at the ceiling, waiting for her to walk straight past. But she stopped in the middle of the room, hesitating, as if she were choosing her words. Michael, her voice sounded weak, as if she was afraid to say anything else. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, before sitting up and facing her. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. But Michael felt no pity. Not now. What do you want, Laura? He asked, his voice low and controlled. She stood there, hugging her body as if that would protect her. Finally, she moved closer and sat down in the seat opposite him. Her eyes sought him out, but he looked away. I didn't sleep all night, she began, her voice breaking. I kept thinking about everything. Thinking about what I've done, what we've become. Don't include me in that, Michael interrupted, with a harshness that made her shudder. I didn't destroy anything. You did it yourself. Laura lowered her head, clasping her hands in her lap. I know that. I know it's my fault, she murmured. But I can't lose you, Michael. I know I made a mistake, but listen to me. I need you to listen to me. Listen to what? He stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. What else do you have to say, Laura? That it was just a mistake? That you still love me? Do you think this will erase the image I saw yesterday? Will it erase the 6 months of lies you've carried around with no remorse? She raised her head, her breathing shaky. You don't understand. I was lost. Lost? Michael laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. No, Laura. Lost is the person trying to find a way. You knew exactly what you were doing. I was unhappy. Her voice rose a tone, and Michael stopped to stare at her. You never realized. Never really looked at me. How long has it been since we were the same couple? You were always so distant, so preoccupied with work, with the bills, with everything but me. Michael looked at her in disbelief. So that's it? It's my fault now. No. She suddenly stood up and walked over to him. I'm not trying to pin this on you. I'm just trying to explain. It's not an excuse, Michael. It's just the truth. I felt invisible. As if you couldn't see me anymore. He appeared at a moment when I was vulnerable. Michael clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. With every word she said, he felt as if a knife was turning in his wound. Vulnerable, he repeated, his voice lower but loaded with contempt. So you thought the best way to deal with this was to betray the man who has loved you for over a decade? Who was by your side every step of the way? Laura started to cry again, but he wasn't moved. Not this time. He needed answers, and nothing she said was enough. Tell me, Laura. What exactly did you expect to happen? That we'd carry on pretending everything was fine? That I'd simply forget what I'd seen? She sobbed, her face streaked with tears. No. She mumbled. I just wanted you to see me again. That you cared. I don't know when it started to fall apart. I was weak, Michael. I was an idiot. He was silent for a moment, looking at her as if searching for some remnant of the woman he loved. Then, with a slow, controlled gesture, he picked up the car keys from the table. It's over, Laura. I don't want to hear any more. Michael, please, she tried to move closer, but he held up his hand to stop her. No. Enough. He walked past her, leaving her alone in the room. The sound of the door closing behind him was like a period, dry, definitive. Hours later, Michael found himself driving aimlessly, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if that could stop his thoughts from consuming him. Every word spoken that morning echoed in his mind. Unhappy. Invisible. How could he not have noticed? Was he somehow to blame too? He didn't want to believe it. Not after everything she'd done. The anger still burned inside him, but now it was beginning to mix with something else, a deep emptiness, a weariness that seemed to drag at every fiber of his body. He stopped the car near a park, where the sound of trees swaying in the wind was the only noise around. Sitting on a wooden bench, he felt the weight of the accumulated tears finally descend. He allowed himself to cry. For the first time since it all began, he let the pain out. He cried for the love he thought would last forever. He cried for the life they had built that was now nothing but ruins. He didn't know how long he stood there, but the sound of soft footsteps approaching made him raise his face. A woman sat down on the bench next to him. She was unknown, perhaps someone who was just looking for the same refuge. Sometimes crying is the only way to move on, she said softly, without even looking at him. Michael didn't reply. He just took a deep breath and let her words echo in his mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe crying really was the first step. But where would he go from there? When he returned home at the end of the day, he found everything silent. The bedroom light was on, and Laura was sitting on the bed, staring at an open suitcase on the floor. I'm leaving, she said, her voice low, without any resistance. Michael stood in the doorway, watching her for a long moment. The scene seemed surreal. He should have felt relief, perhaps even satisfaction, but all he felt was emptiness. It's best for both of us, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Laura got up, picked up her suitcase and walked over to him. When she stopped in front of him, she looked into his eyes one last time. "I'm sorry, Michael. More than you know." He nodded, but didn't reply. There was nothing more to be said. She left, leaving him alone in the corridor, surrounded by silence that, this time, seemed much more definitive. Michael returned to the empty room and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the space where her suitcase had been moments before and realized that, despite everything, a part of him still wanted to hate her less. A part of him still loved the woman she had once been. But now there was no more room for that love. And what came next, he knew, would change everything. The house seemed even emptier than before. The sound of Michael's footsteps echoed through the corridors like a lonely ghost, an echo that seemed to shout out the absence left by Laura. There were no more voices exchanging trivia, nor the murmur of restrained words that had hung between them for the last few months. Now there was only silence. And that silence was almost deafening. In the living room, he stopped in front of the shelf where the photos from the wedding and the trips they had taken together still stood. He picked one of them up. It was an old picture, taken on a beach during their honeymoon. Laura's smile in that photo was real, full of life, and his eyes shone with a love that seemed unshakable. Michael stared at the cold glass of the picture frame and felt his chest tighten. He leaned his head on his hands, his elbows firmly on his knees, while a part of him tried to understand how they had got there. It was like watching a movie backwards, love torn apart, memories fading, everything in ruins. He didn't want to think about her anymore, but the memories insisted on returning like waves crashing against sharp rocks. His cell phone rang on the table, snapping him out of his trance. Michael looked at the display, an unknown number. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, but the insistence made him answer. "Hello." His voice sounded hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken for hours. "Mr. Michael?" The voice on the other end was formal, almost rehearsed. "This is Thomas, from the legal department of the company where your wife works." Michael frowned, feeling his heart race. Her name, coming from that distant voice, sounded out of place. "Yes, it's me. What's going on?" "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but it's important. We thought you should know about some irregularities that have been detected. Recently, a fraud scheme linked to the marketing team's contracts was uncovered." Michael remained silent, trying to absorb what he had heard. The words entered his mind like sharp knives, one after the other. Fraud. Contracts. Marketing team. "I'm sorry, but what have I got to do with it?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the chaos that was beginning to take over his thoughts. "The thing is, Laura was involved in this, sir. Some contracts and expenses were attributed to her and her colleague." Michael felt the air escape from his lungs, as if someone had punched him in the stomach. He stood up, walking around the room as if movement could stop the explosion of thoughts that was beginning to take shape. The man continued talking, explaining details about internal audits and evidence collected, but Michael could no longer hear properly. Every word was a distant blur, except her name. When the call ended, he threw himself on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. The knot in his stomach that had been tormenting him since the moment of the betrayal now tightened even more. The pain of being betrayed wasn't enough, now there was an extra layer, dirty and incomprehensible. He tried to search for answers in his own mind, but all he found was a desolate void. How could she have gotten involved in something like this? It was the question that kept hammering away. Laura, who had always been methodical and ethical, was now at the center of a scandal that could destroy her career. And it all seemed to have a connection with that man, that lover. Michael felt his chest burn with anger as he remembered his face, the same face that had smiled at her at the party, as if he had already won. The day dawned without him having slept a wink. When the sun finally lit up the room, Michael made a decision. He needed to understand everything, he needed to confront Laura one last time, not just because of the betrayal, but because of everything that was being revealed. Hours later, Michael stopped in front of the building where Laura was living temporarily, at a friend's house. He hesitated for a moment, his hand on the steering wheel, feeling his heart beating heavily in his chest. He was nervous, but he had to do it. He knocked on the door and, when she opened it, the look they exchanged was almost unbearable. Laura was different. She looked smaller, more fragile. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen with tears, and yet when she saw Michael standing there, her shoulders slumped as if she knew that this encounter was inevitable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low. "We need to talk," he replied, entering without waiting for permission. The room was simple but cozy. It felt like a place she was just passing through. "I've had a call. From your company's legal department." Laura froze in the middle of the room, her face paling even more. Michael saw her reaction and knew right then that it was true. "Did you know they were going to find out?" he asked, his voice controlled but harsh. "How long has this been going on, Laura?" "Michael, please," she began, but he interrupted her. "No, no more, please. I want the truth. I deserve the truth. Did you steal money from the company? Why? Was it your idea or his? Was it your idea or his? Did you plan it together?" Laura sat on the sofa, holding her head in her hands. The image of her in that state almost made Michael give up. But he had to know. "I didn't plan anything," she muttered, unable to face him. "He got me involved. I didn't know at first, he asked me to sign some documents, said they were common procedures. And by the time I realized what it was too late. I was trapped. She took a deep breath, sobbing. "He manipulated me, Michael. I was naive." Michael remained silent, absorbing every word. He felt torn between anger and disbelief. He wanted to scream, he wanted to accuse her, but deep down he knew it wouldn't solve anything. "Did you love him?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. Laura looked at him in surprise and shook her head slowly. "No. I thought he offered me something that was missing. Attention, passion, but it was all a lie. He just wanted to use me, and I let him. I ruined everything." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the pain come flooding back. He didn't know what was worse, the betrayal, the deceit, or the realization that the woman he loved was completely lost. "What's going to happen now?" he asked, looking at her. "I don't know. The company will probably sue me. I'll lose everything. My career, my reputation." Laura stared at him, her eyes watering. "But what hurts the most, Michael, is having lost you." Michael looked away. He didn't want to see the pain on her face. He didn't want to feel sorry. He stood up and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the doorknob and, without looking back, said, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, Laura. Maybe, in time, things will make sense. But not now. I can't." And then he left, leaving her alone in that empty room. When he got home, the weight he was carrying seemed even greater. He threw himself on the sofa, closing his eyes and letting the silent tears fall. He felt exhausted, as if he had aged years in just a few days. The dilemma that consumed him now was cruel. The woman he loved no longer existed, but her shadow still haunted him. He knew he had to move on, but how do you do that when everything you've built has been destroyed? The wind blew cold that morning. Dry leaves danced across the driveway of the house where Michael still lived. The house seemed different now, silent in a way that didn't bring peace, but a constant reminder of what had been lost. The boxes stacked in the corner of the living room signaled the end of yet another cycle. He was ready to move. It was the most logical decision. Staying there was like living inside a ghost memory. Michael looked around for the last time, the bare walls, the echo of his own footsteps like a farewell. A year had passed since that night, since the betrayal, the scandal, the crumbling of everything he believed in. He had lost track of how many times he wondered if he could have done something differently, if he could have seen the signs earlier. But the truth, he had learned, was that carrying the blame for something that wasn't his responsibility would only imprison him even more. In that time, a lot had happened. Laura was no longer in his life. He didn't know exactly where she was now, but every now and then, news of her would reach him like distant echoes. She had lost everything, her job, her credibility, her friends. The fraud scheme had been completely exposed, and her lover had disappeared in the middle of the scandal, leaving her to carry the weight of the consequences alone. Michael would later learn that he had masterminded the whole thing, and Laura, in her fragility, had been used as a pawn. It was a cruel blow for her, but not enough to bring back what they had lost. He thought of her at that moment, not with anger, but with a deep weariness. Laura had been the great love of his life, and seeing her destroy herself by her own choices was a pain he had to carry for a long time. But Michael was determined to move on. He knew he couldn't stay stuck in the past any longer. He deserved to start again. When he closed the door to the house, he felt like he was leaving behind a part of himself, something he would never get back. But along with that, he was also leaving the weight of lies and betrayal. Freedom, however painful, was still freedom. Laura looked at her reflection in the window of the small apartment where she now lived. The room was simple, almost empty, but clean and organized. She had sold what was left of her possessions to pay off some of the debts she had accumulated after the scandal. There were no more luxuries, no more parties, no more sycophantic colleagues to surround her. Silence was her only company now. She worked in a simple job, far from the glamour and pressure of her old position. It was a modest life, but somehow it brought a kind of calm she hadn't known before. Still, every night, before going to sleep, her mind returned to the same scene, Michael looking at her with those pain-filled eyes, the cold words he had said before leaving. She had thrown away the best she had, and nothing could change that. From time to time, she thought about calling him, about trying to explain one last time. But there were no more explanations. Time had passed, and Michael deserved his peace. All she could do was move on, carrying the weight of her choices. She looked out onto the street again, where people were hurrying along. For a moment, she felt a tear run down her cheek, but she didn't allow herself to cry. Not anymore. She had to accept her new reality. Months later, Michael was sitting in a cafe near his new office. He had moved to a different neighborhood, away from all the old memories. It was a busier place, with unfamiliar faces and streets that held no memories. A complete fresh start. While he was leafing through some papers, the door to the cafe opened and a soft voice caught his attention. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Michael looked up and saw a woman standing in front of him, holding a cup. She had long hair in a messy bun and a smile that seemed too sincere for someone he didn't know. "No, you can sit down," he replied, surprised by his own kindness. She settled down in front of him and smiled again. "Thank you very much. It's always crowded here." Michael nodded, not knowing what to say. He had closed himself off from meeting people recently. He was suspicious of everyone and everything, but there was something about this woman that made him relax. They chatted casually over coffee, the weather and the busy day. She introduced herself as Emily, an architect who was passing through the area for a project. Her presence was light, and Michael was surprised to notice that, for the first time in a long time, he was smiling effortlessly. When the coffee was finished, Emily stood up, thanking him for his company. "I hope we meet again," she said, before leaving. Michael stared at the door for a few seconds, feeling a small flame ignite inside him. Something he thought he would never feel again, hope. Laura, meanwhile, was walking down the sidewalk after another day at work. She was carrying a bag with a loaf of bread and some fruit. Life was lonely, but she had learned to live with it. Deep down, she knew that this was her penance, and perhaps even deserved. She passed a newsstand and saw the name of her old company printed in a small headline. The headline talked about new hires and financial recovery after the scandal. She looked away and kept walking, swallowing her pain. She was no longer part of that world and, in a way, that was a relief. Her life was real now. Harsh, but real. A place where lies no longer had a place. That night, sitting alone in her bed, she opened a notebook where she wrote daily reflections. There, she scribbled a few words before closing her eyes. I ruined the best I had. I hope he's happy now. And that someday, I too can find peace. Michael was walking through a square, the dry leaves of autumn crunching under his shoes. The sunlight gilded the trees, and the wind carried a scent of renewal. He stopped in front of a flower stall and, without thinking too much, bought a small bouquet. He continued walking until he stopped in front of a bench where Emily was sitting with a book in her hands. She saw him approaching and smiled. Did you bring flowers? How romantic. Let's just say I'm trying to learn how to start again, he replied, handing her the bouquet. She took the flowers carefully, looking at him with a warm expression. You're doing well. Michael sat down next to her and, for the first time in a long time, felt the weight on his chest begin to dissipate. The past still existed, but it no longer defined who he was. He had chosen to move on. And at that moment, he realized that he was finally ready to live again. If you liked this story, let us know what you thought. Your opinion is very important and helps us to keep bringing you impactful stories like this one. And don't forget, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. The stories are fictional, but the lessons are real. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories, and see you next time.